Welcome to Opera 101 with Holy City Arts and Lyric Opera. My name is Ashley Emerson, and I am the Technical Associate for Opera 101. So thanks for joining us and continuing your operatic education. The directors of Halo, Leah Edwards Pitas and Dimitri Pitas, are actually, as we speak, doing a concert, one of their social distancing concerts outdoors in the Charleston area. So I'm happy to get us all started today. And for more information about this, Opera 101, the social distancing concerts, which Halo has been putting on for over a year now, and all kinds of other offerings that Halo has online and in the Low Country, you can visit holycityarts.org. I will drop that information into the chat a little later. You can find links to previous Opera 101 lectures, info on upcoming performances. I may or may not be participating in one of the social distancings soon in a couple of weeks that I'm very excited about. You can subscribe to our email list. There are also links to make donations so that Halo can continue to bring you content like this and lots of other fun things. And like I said, if there are any questions or comments during today's lecture, we love to hear from you. So please drop anything you like in the chat. And last week's lecture, which was with Margaret Fournier, focused on kind of father figures in the operas of Giuseppe Verdi. Today will also be about Verdi, and it will expound on different parts of Giuseppe Verdi's music and why we're all kind of still about it. So this is the third in a series of 5 presentations we're doing on Opera 101 called From Soup to Nuts, Devouring Opera with William Berger. A lecturer, serious radio commentator, opera author, and opera aficionado Will Berger is back with us today to talk about why we're still all about Verdi and about some of Verdi's people. So without further ado, I bring you Will to get us going. And let me add spotlight. Thank you so much, Will, for being here and joining us again.
Thanks, Ashley. Great to be here. I have a quick question. Now, you had a class last week on father figures in Verdi. Have you had any other Verdi classes? So I know what we're riffing off of or what's new information, or I know people come and gone for the different ones.
I don't recall any other specific Verdi classes since I've been here in January.
Okay.
There may have been a class on Traviata or on a specific Verdi opera earlier in the fall.
Right.
I don't recall anything else Verdi related.
I think that sounds familiar. Yeah. Okay, great. In a way, it doesn't matter. So that's the good news. Okay, let's get to it because I do have to move on shortly after 3 for the other thing. We're doing at the Metropolitan Opera from home, and we're doing the opera quiz today. We're taping it live. So it'll be a live, as if live, but on tape for a week from Saturday. So, and that'll be it's really fun doing the opera quiz on Zoom. Trust me, it's a laugh a minute. Okay, so, but that's that. This is Verdi, without whom there is no opera. I always say I don't have a favorite opera composer, but if I did, it would be Verdi. What he is ubiquitous in the opera world. There is no opera world without Verdi. I think it's something like 30% of all opera performances are Verdi, something like that, or it was when I wrote the book. I have a book on Verdi, which is trying to pack a lot of information into one volume. He's kind of a 3-volume composer because of the arc of his career, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But there's not only so much of his work, because that's true of other composers too. It's that it keeps getting better. the longer time goes on, the more we realize how great his achievement was. And when he started, when he hit, he was very famous, very popular. He was box office, not only in Italy, but around the world. Um, and he had this genius for creating melodies that were instantly recognizable, some of the most famous melodies ever created. As you discover Verdi, you'll realize, oh, he wrote that. I'm probably just right off the top of my head, I'm thinking da 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 da, da, right? Not only famous, but parodied. That we live in Verdi's music, but and they couldn't know this in his time. It took hundreds of years to learn this. That's just one level, the initial impression his music makes on you. And there are a lot of people whose music makes a great initial impression and then less of one later on. Verdi is, the more you get to know him, the more profound it is. So, real quickly, what we can do here today is not a lot for Verdi, but what I'm going to do is propose some models for listening to his entire corpus of works. He has 27, 28 operas, depending on how you count them, over a 60 plus year career in the theater. So there's a lot of it. It's, if you add it all up, the average quality level is supremely high of all of it. And so I can't do a greatest hits, which would be fun, but instead I'm going to look at some ways of listening to Verdi to keep unpacking it. Because like there was a class last week, there will be others. There was a Traviata class, there will be others. Just very quickly to give it context, Giuseppe Verdi, whose name does mean Joe Green, which just means he's just not claiming to be in any way an extraordinary person. He's claiming to be a very average person of his time and place, Italy. He was born in the Parma region in north central Italy in the year 1813 during a battle of the Napoleonic Wars. When Napoleon retreated from Russia, his army split into two forks, as it were. One went the northern route, one went the southern route to get back to France. The southern route went through where Verdi was born. When he was born, there was a battle raging. The northern route went through where Wagner was born in Germany while Wagner was being born in 1813. I don't know what that means, but I'm convinced it means something. Um, and he was born to tavern keepers, innkeepers in the countryside, not but farm country. Uh, and he had very musical training. He did play organ in the local church and he took lessons with people, but he pretty quickly moved on from there and tried to get into the conservatory in Milan and was not accepted. Years later, they offered many it after him, and he said absolutely not, because he was very well, he was very, as they say in Italian, testa dura. He was very stubborn. And if you slighted him in 1821, he remembered it in 19. That was the way he was. And he went to Milan and the theater there, La Scala. He wrote an opera, Oberto Conte di San Bonifacio, Oberto Count of Boniface, that was very good, and it got some notice, particularly of the prima, the leading lady, who thought it was terrific. Her name was Giuseppina Streponi, and she became Mrs. Giuseppe Verdi many years later. He wrote another opera, Un giorno di regno, a comedy. It was not conducive to his genius. It flopped. It was a disaster. And he swore, this was in 1840, he'd never write another opera. Every year until he died in 1901, he swore he was never writing another opera. And he wrote 28 more of them. Famously, in 1842 or 43, I never remember, I think it's 42, he hit his first big hit, and it was a doozy. And it was called Nabucco, based on Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament, in the Bible. And it was a, as they say in Italian, furore. When you have a success, you have a success. If you have a real success, it's a madness. It's a furore. And it was a sensation. It was a very, it became part of the public's growing awareness of Italian nationalism very directly. Italy, this is important, Italy at this time was not a country. It was separate, small countries, mostly occupied by foreign powers. This keeps coming back in our story, and so on. And there was this movement toward creating a country where there never had been one as a political entity. There had been in the early Middle Ages a thing called the Kingdom of Italy, which was not quite shaped where we now think of Italy, but there had never been a country as a political entity of Italy. There had always been the geographical idea. There had always been an Italian language. Well, not always, but you know what I mean. And this sense of Italian identity. But there was a growing movement in 1842 of we need to be a country, a modern country on the map, that you can see. And this is called the Risorgimento, the resurgence, the rising again. Of course, Italy, that it had the Renaissance, the rebirth a few hundred years before. It's always in the process of rising again, which becomes part of our story. And Verdi became very associated with that from this moment on. Now, you will famously, of course, be played, and perhaps already have been, the chorus from Nabucco that was such a sensation, and it still is, called Va Pensiero, that I just don't know what it is about Va Pensiero. And I've sat down, I've tried to, like, what did he nail there? It was something. And years later, it was sung spontaneously by 300,000 mourners at his funeral in Milan. But we're not going to listen to that now. But do listen to it if you don't know it, or even if you do. But instead, I'm going to play an interesting part of Nabucco in a moment, which is an ensemble. And the reason I'm going to play this is I'm going to show how Verdi used at this in his. Hold on. Before I get to that, when we talked about Mozart, if you were here, and you know who you were, if you're awesome, a couple weeks ago, and I compared Mozart to the Beatles in the way that it's a problem that everyone keeps saying how great Mozart is, that it gets in the way of just appreciating how great Mozart is. To bring up the Beatles again, oddly, there's something about Verdi's career that I've noticed is very interestingly analogous to the Beatles' career, which, of course, as the Beatles, only lasted 6 years. But if you take 6 years and make them 6 decades, the analogy is really interesting. You can learn a lot by comparing the music's effect. The Beatles in 1963, 7 years, in 1963 hit really big on the charts. It was Beatlemania, and there was the Ed Sullivan Show and all that, #1 hits, and they were a pop sensation. And then people started saying, there's actually something more going on here. And there was famously 6 months after that, there was a review where a critic started comparing what they were doing to Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, and there was this whole growth of like kind of brainy criticism of the music going alongside with the pop sensation. And then there were other developments where they started doing things on their own that weren't even, there was no name for them yet. They stopped touring, they stopped going for pop chart success, and they started doing their own thing. And you had in their later career these things like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the White Album, that were completely, absolutely new, but were also part of a continuum of their career. And you have the same thing with Verdi, and in a weird way. And you have his early career where he was a pop sensation, and then you have an impossibly successful middle career, and then you have an also successful but very different late career where he was doing his own thing. He had the luxury of writing whatever he wanted for himself, and it would get produced and it would be successful. But and the critics, the academics and all them were blown away by the later things most directly and talked to us about how we should love Otello and Falstaff, and we do. But they also kind of created this atmosphere, a little bit of a condescending attitude to the earlier works, because they were just kind of pop and had good melodies and stuff. And I think that, as with the Beatles, that's why I bring it up, to understand what the accomplishment of the late completely wild things were, it is absolutely necessary to appreciate the early things which were ignored for many years. And they're easy to love, and there's nothing stupid about them. They seem old-fashioned in a way only because of where Verdi took us later on. But I want to go back to his first success. Think of this as the I Want to Hold Your Hand in a lot of ways of Giuseppe Verdi. And not the big hit Va Pensiero, but another part. So I seem to have hit my video off, which is fine. So let's hear the Nabucco.
Fausto grida annunzia godere la morte. Oh padre, tutti il portiamo vita e costoro condanna. Oh che porco, io quest'ore non mi detta, mi pensa e mi rivolge con le ore. Ferma, assicura. Appresta non torna di tutto scolor. Le folgo intorno, già sfiurono là, ora presta un giorno di un
Nabucco, Act 2. Okay, now you notice what happened there. Everyone's run. The details don't matter. I'm talking about the structure of getting information across. Everybody's running around. There's something very stressful going on. There are groups of people. Somebody's about to take the crown. They said the king is dead, and he walks in. I'm not dead. Who dares to say I'm dead? So you have one of these. I tried to say this in a book, my editor wouldn't let me, but zoinks moments where like everybody goes, zoinks, what's happening? And it's as if time stops, and then you get all that running around stops, and you get kind of a rhythm and melody. You get a melody that's absolutely unforgettable. It's meant to catch your attention. And it started by the baritone, significantly. We'll get to that. And then the soprano comes in, then the tenor, then another soprano, mezzo maybe, depends. And they're all singing the same tune. And then the chorus comes in. This is an ensemble altogether. If you want a fancy $10 drop it at the grand tier word, you can use pezzo concertato. And this was a thing that they did in early 19th century opera. And it accomplished a lot, and people liked it, and it sort of, you'll notice the tune he was singing, we talked about this a little with Mozart, but it's very four square. It's four lines, and it's A, B, C, A, basically. First line, variation, a weird variation, and then bring it all back home. And then the next person takes off, okay? And like a church hymn, it's meant to, dun da 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 dun bum bum dun da 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 dun da da variation dun da 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 dun dun da bring it all back home dun bum 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 bum. It's inclusive. You hear it once, you know how it's going to go again. The chorus comes in just to sing the same hymn. And in the early 19th century, in the operas we call bel canto, in the vocally driven dramas of Rossini and Donizetti and Bellini and others, this was what you did at the end of either Act 2 or 3 to sort of get everyone there. But the problem if it be such, is that they said it stops the action and therefore it's not realistic. And it was Verdi who was saying, I got to stop doing this. But people liked it. So right away you get that split between what is popular and what is considered good. And then you get critics up until recent times saying, okay, well, it's just kind of coarse. And there is a certain coarseness to it. You'll notice the orchestra is not doing phenomenally complex things. The orchestra is there to provide rhythm, a rhythmic movement forward. Usually, yes, it is a 3/4 beat. So that's an uneven beat, right? Like the waltz is a 3/4. It's a perpetual motion machine. There's a beat missing, so it's not 4 square. It keeps going forward like a waltz. And that's what people put down about early Verdi melodiousness, saying, well, it's pa. Notice pa is a waltz. But it's also very infectious. It's very rock and roll. And I say that pointedly, that the instrumental is there for rhythmic propulsion to move it forward. The vocal is there on top to capture you. Okay. We have since learned, because we've had Einstein and Picasso and everybody, and relativity and all sorts of neat things, that some moments in time take longer than others. In the late 19th century, when they had like to have standardized time for trains to run and not run into each other, that's why we got standardized time, they thought that if it wasn't linear, you were stopping time. We have since learned that time does stop sometimes, or not stop, but some moments take longer than others. And this is a way in which Verdi, and I mean early Verdi, the Italian nationalist, is not as old-fashioned as it used to be. That we, who have had experiences of Einstein and rock and roll and jazz and other things that play with time, can appreciate it in a way our grandparents can't. So now we have a baritone. Okay, now I'm going to play. I'm not supposed to have favorites of any of this, but let's play some Hernani. Okay, what's going on here? Just as much of a setup. We have Charles V, the Emperor Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who shows up in more operas than you care to shake a stick at. And here he is. This is a play by Victor Hugo, Hernani, that was one of those plays that Victor Hugo wrote, and everybody on stage got tossed in jail for the night. It was just, no, they weren't having it. You know, the law was not having it. So, of course, Verdi set it to music. And it's terrific, and I love it. This is his third big hit. And so Charles V is, there are all these conspirators, and they're going to kill him, and they're gathered at the tomb of Charlemagne from 1,000 years before. Don't worry about why, they just are. And they say they're going to kill this guy who's trying to get elected emperor to be Charles V. And he comes out of the tomb with a bunch of soldiers and says, arrest them all. And he's going to kill them all or throw them all in jail or whatever. And instead he has a come to Jesus moment, quite literally. And he digs deep and says, I should be more like Charlemagne. I should forgive them. Hit it.
Oh mie brame ottone, sposi voi siate, amate ognor, a Carlo Magno sia gloria e
I don't know why, but at that last time when he comes back in and says, Sarò lo giuro, just with that theme, I get completely choked up. And it's not what he's saying in the words. It never is in opera. It's what the voices are doing. And here I'm going to say it again. I said this before in the overview. There's one person in history who knew the human voice, la voce umana, this quarter inch of cartilage in our throats, better than anybody else who has ever lived. And his name was Giuseppe Verdi, and fight me over it. And to get to that point where you can say the same thing, we go beyond the words and just what is he saying with those voices? The words are important, but only as part of getting us there. And okay, so again, we have the harp this time, dun, 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 and then this sort of melody that just comes off of the air. Right? And then, he makes his declaration and then says, let the honor be to Charlemagne, Charles I. And everyone, all of a sudden, all these voices come at you and say, no, the honor to Charles V, to you, you're the good guy, right? And they go back and forth and it's all layered. You notice it's a men's chorus with one woman's voice. That becomes an issue later. Really good use of that. And then together, they land somewhere else in a new melody. Dun, 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 dun. And it's pa, it's 3/4, it's still moving forward in its own proportion. Think of like, the rock rhythm guitarist, right? It's erotic. It is in the true sense of the word, in the Greek sense of the word. It's procreative. It is life affirming. The one, then the other gives birth to a third thing. And that's a beautiful thing. And Verdi did it really well. And people got riled up by these operas. I mean, they went out in the streets and rioted after good performances in the 1840s. We don't quite do that the same way, but it's still, that's the effect they're supposed to have. Life affirming. Now, I didn't mean to make these this largely baritone centric, but Verdi used all the voices really well. And well, I have a theory. We'll see if I have time to get to it. But I'm sure last week, I believe the lecturer was talking about Verdi's biography and his history and the loss of his first wife and 2 kids all at the same time. And that so many of his operas are famous for this father-daughter trope, for lack of a better word. We already saw it in Nabucco once in a weird way, where the king and his kind of hellcat daughter are the main relationship in the story. And it's something that comes up over and over in various forms. In La Traviata, in Aida, we'll see in a moment, in lots of his operas. And people talk a lot about how this came out of Verdi's personal experience in his biography. And I don't know if I believe that or don't believe it. I think it's very interesting to look at, but I think there's more to it than that. And I think there's something about the baritone voice and the soprano voice in unison, or not unison, but playing off of each other, that covers a spectrum for Verdi. And I think there's a non-literal use of voices that is so powerful. And all right, I'll just go off on that for 2 minutes. But I have a theory. I haven't worked it out, but the voices that he uses, I mean, I could play all soprano arias of the greatest hits of Verdi, and it would be great. Certainly tenor arias. But the way he uses them is for, and this is the part that I'm sure of, not who they represent in society, not the father or the daughter or the lover, the tenor, or the authority figure, the bass, so much as, and the bad woman, the mezzo, so much as, sorry, Ashley, I know I'm flattering sopranos here, but as those voices represent impulses in us. And the soprano voice, and this I have thought about quite a bit, the soprano voice is the voice that will be heard. We had the Met campaign. The voice must be heard. That was mine. And I was actually talking about the soprano voice, which is, I have in me that voice that like can tell an entire chorus of 100 and orchestra of 100 to shut up, because just by the sheer physics of it, I can cut through that noise. It's not decibels, it's close to decibels. It's some way that you can hear a soprano voice amidst all this other noise, and so on. We'll look at that in a moment. The tenor voice. Tenors, I wish Dimitri were here, because we've all made great jokes about, we talked about this in Mozart when we had the Act 2 finale of The Marriage of Figaro, of how there were all these low voices because they were thinking, dun, 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 dun. And then the sopranos over it are like, oh, I'm so nervous, I'm so nervous. And what we didn't have in that ensemble is a tenor, because the tenor voice, there are lots of easy jokes about stupid tenors. Some are, some aren't. Some of the smartest people I've known have been tenors. But the tenor voice does not represent thinking. The tenor voice represents action. do it and think about it later. And I remember Ken Tritle, my great choral conductor here in New York, telling us with the Verdi Requiem, where the big theme of the Dies Irae, the last day, Judgment Day, is in the tenors. Oh my God, the universe is ending. Ah, bass drum. And he told us a story of when he grew up on a horse farm and the barn was on fire and they had to get the horses out, and he went through the whole thing. They had to throw blinders over the horses and not let them think and get out. And he said, that's what I want to hear from the tenors in the Dies Irae of the Verdi Requiem. And it was like, zoinks, I get it. So the tenor voice you can experience Il Trovatore of Giuseppe Verdi, a greatly misunderstood opera, but a rock and roll masterpiece. And the tenor sings, again, we have propulsion, it's 5/4. Dun, dun, ba-rum, bum, 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 ba-rum, di quella pira. Okay, but what's happening is they tell him, your mother's on fire. And he says, my mother's on fire, we have to save her. It's an easily parodied moment. So he sings this aria. Dun, dun, ba-dum, bum, bum. And it's an alarm. We've got to go right now. And then he sings it again. And all of my literal thinking friends, including some music people, are like, that's so stupid. How can you say, in fact, it was parodied, if you've ever experienced the Pirates of Penzance. They parody that in the, yes, we go to die in, bloody battle, and they're not going anywhere. They're standing still, marching like this. And the woman says to them, yes, or the man says, but you don't go. You're not going. Yes. But in Il Trovatore, it takes 4 minutes to explore the feeling of we've got to go now. And we've got to not think about it. And that's why the tenor voice represents those things you don't think about, you worry about later, you just do. 2 things, making love and going into battle. If you thought about either of them, you probably wouldn't. So it's like, no, we've got to do this right now. It's in the voice, in the physics of the voice. So they're not necessarily stupid. They're that impulse. Whereas then you get the baritone who's, well, one, the bad guy, but also, now wait a second, let's think about this. Reflection, like we just heard in Hernani. Now wait a second. I could kill all of you, or maybe I won't. Maybe I'll be a better person. Dun, 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 dun. And that baritone voice just represents that so well. And basses can be the high priest, the voice of God, anyone who's really a little scary. They don't have to be, but they encapsulate that feeling so well. We have all these voices in us, no matter who you are. You're a young woman, young man, old man, doesn't matter. You have all those voices. And Verdi knew how to pluck them in you by using their voices. Now, I'm going to have to skip Attila, which is too bad because it's really good, but it's long. And this is another misunderstood early opera of Verdi's where we have all these voices in conjunction layered on to depict the historical mythological moment of the founding of the city of Venice. Again, a place that rises up after the ashes, like the Phoenix, La Fenice Theater in Venice, for which it was written. And watch it sometime. Just look at the prologue scene 2 of Attila. Go to YouTube, whatever. And what you have, just really quickly, is, I know I got excited. You have hermits living out in the swamps, basses, and then they're praising the sunrise over sea and sky. They're doing their prayers. And they end with this big note, Lodel Creator, praise to the Creator. Ah, and then it's echoed, engendered. It draws forth women and high voices who are refugees from Attila the Hun, no less, on the mainland, who's burning everything. And they're floating on boats across the lagoon. And together they all land, and a tenor says, let's do it. Let's build a city here. Not just a city, right here in the middle of a swamp. We're going to build the most beautiful city in the world. And they do, and it's Venice, and it's a sacred historical moment. And it's all done with voices. So check that out. But for a more concrete example, Rigoletto, 1851. This really begins the phase in Verdi's life. It's only 8 years after Nabucco, but where he is the recognized, most famous, wealthiest, biggest hit composer in the world. And he wrote Rigoletto, and right after Il Trovatore and La Traviata at the same time. He wrote them concurrently. And in fact, they're very much mirror images of each other. It's another whole talk. But it is not possible for a human to have done that. You start thinking in terms of divine inspiration or something. But anyway, Rigoletto is one of these operas that I think I want to put a ban on performances for 10 years until we all digest it and come back to it. It's one of my favorite, like La Bohème of Puccini. I've done more live broadcasts of Rigoletto than anybody in history, and I never, ever, ever have come close to having a moment of saying, what am I going to say about it tonight that's different? Forget about it. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And it's written now, interestingly, it's written, a lot of these operas were written to be seen more than once. Nabucco still holds sales records at La Scala. It had 57 consecutive performances. 9 times the population of the city of Milan at that time bought tickets for Nabucco, which means people bought tickets over and over, which means that was how you were expected to hear them. So if you say, oh, I don't want to see Rigoletto, I've seen it. No, that's not how it works. And there are foreshadowings, and this becomes very important later next time when we talk about La Bohème of Puccini. There are foreshadowings that you cannot know until you've heard it a bunch of times. Like I said at the beginning, so in Rigoletto, he wrote the most famous tune ever written. And interestingly, La Donna è Mobile, for the tenor, about women are fickle, of course, very ironic. And he knew when he wrote that he had written what would become the most famous tune in the world. So he didn't put it in the score until the night of the premiere, because he also knew he had written an earworm that if you heard it once, you would be humming it for the rest of your life. Which is why, so he handed the music to the tenor at intermission, which is why it's right after intermission, and said, oh, by the way, sing this. Which is why it's very simple orchestration. Bum, 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 ba-dum, because everybody in the orchestra got the music that night. And it comes in the last act, the last scene of the last act of Rigoletto. And the story goes well attested in newspapers that when people left the theater in Venice, the bands that were playing in the Piazza San Marco, they're still there, in front of the cafes, were playing La Donna è Mobile. Which means somebody ran out of the theater and said, oh my God, you guys, it goes like this. Dun, 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 dun. Play it. And they did. It was already a #1 hit. But that's not the core of Rigoletto. That's the one that makes you go, wow, what's this? And go back again. And then you start, you keep mining it. Go experience Rigoletto. Right now, what I'm going to do is a father-daughter thing. A supreme father-daughter. We have some extreme characters. Another play by Victor Hugo. And in a nutshell, we have the court jester here, Rigoletto, the hunchback and everything. He's deformed. It's a big issue with him. And he is a very complex, always said to be Shakespearean character. He's very, very bad. He does bad things. He slanders people as part of being a court jester and gets them in trouble and all this. But he has one thing in which he puts all his good, and that's his daughter. He has a secret daughter nobody even knows about, and he keeps her sequestered from the world. And he comes home and to visit her, and he tells the maid, who is really one of the useless people of all opera, like, lady, you had one job. Okay, keep her safe. Don't let anybody see her. Well, of course, she takes a bribe from the tenor within 2 minutes, but whatever. So right here, what happens here in this part I'm going to play is he says, this is my only treasure in life. And then she comes back and says, basically, I love you, Father, because she's never known another man. And I don't mean biblically, she just has never met another man, except her confessor that she's never seen. And then they sing together. So we have more of this layering. And listen to what happens. We have a very famous baritone and soprano here, Tito Gobbi and Maria Callas. A very unusual role for Maria Callas, playing this very innocent to the point of absurdity young woman who has never been out in the world. And here's part of the duet when they sing together real quickly. Let's have a listen. Where did I go? There I am. Okay. I think the boldness of the simplicity of his melodic line, not all of Rigoletto is like that. Some of it is very formless, and he has these narratives that you don't know where it's going next, and it's amazing. But then to come, I wish I had a chalkboard. I've done this on the chalkboard, but in Rigoletto, you can actually put the notes on the chalkboard and read a story, even if you read music very poorly like I do. But what you had there, see if I can do this with my hands. Okay, you had another one of his literally four line melodies, that A, B, A. A, repeat it, A, B, variation, and A, bring it all on home, repeating the beginning, right? Or more or less. And so he's saying that. And again, I think time is a little suspended with the pizzicato there. Like, you can kind of hear him, like, they're almost like afraid, they're breathing. Anyway, whatever. You have his line here. Da, 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 da. Okay. Da, 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 da. Bum, 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 bum. Okay, and then, so what does she do? She literally decorates his line. Dum, bum, 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 da, 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 bum, 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 bum. When he goes up, da, 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 and so on and so forth. It's their relationship. It's in the note. His line is flat and unadorned. The only beauty in his life is her, his daughter. She's the decoration and the only decoration in his life. But wait, here's the zoinks moment. You have a different story from her point of view. If you look at her notes, you have this, young, it just sounds young with those notes, beautiful, like she's a garland around his branch. So she's his only decoration, but from her point of view, she's trying to grow, but can't, but never gets away from him. She can't. Until she does in the Act Two duet. Da 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 bum ba 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 ba. And when she actually says, that's weird what she says, but yes, I know he's a scoundrel, and yes, he raped me, but I'm going to stand by him. And she breaks away from him, from her father, who's trying to say, don't do that, musically. It's in the notes. You can read it. And that's why I keep saying what I said from the very beginning. Don't come here for the beautiful music, because there are many easier ways to enjoy beautiful music. Come here for the truth, and especially with Verdi. And that's what Toscanini said. He said it, Toscanini, the great conductor who knew Verdi, who studied with him a little in a weird way, and then was kind of rivals with Puccini. He said it as a diss at Puccini. Like, okay, yeah, Puccini is really very good, but Verdi is true. And he talks about, in fact, La Traviata, the scene with the baritone, the father figure. It's his father, but still. And he takes apart the notes and he says, that is how humans are. It's the way in a Tolstoy novel, when you've got War and Peace, when you go, that is exactly what a 16-year-old girl would do in that situation. And it is, and it's amazing, and so on and so forth. That's Verdi, the truth. Okay, I have to go do the quiz. So what we're going to do now is we're going to conclude with Aida, which is 1870, Christmas Eve. For a long time, it was Verdi's greatest hit, the culmination. Remember, after every one of these operas, he's never writing another one. And everybody thought Aida, well, that he nailed it with that one. He certainly is not going to write anything else. Then he wrote the Requiem, which is even better and bigger. It's not an opera, but it is a drama of life against death. And he said, I'm never writing anything again. And he did. And then he wrote Otello, which is the greatest Italian opera. There, I said it. And then he wrote Falstaff, which is even, in many ways, even beyond Otello. So these were his latest. 1893 was Falstaff. 1842 was Nabucco. So he covered a lot of not only his own growth, but world history. But in 1870 and 71, he wrote Aida. And Aida was meant to be here. This is what I've been trying to say. It is the clearest opera. It is the opera that is right there. There's no subtext. There's no subplot. There's the soprano, Aida. There's the tenor, the soldier, because what do tenors do? They go to war and they make love. And there's the other woman, Amneris, very important role for the mezzo, Princess of Egypt, two countries at war. It's all very clear. Before Aida, he wrote Don Carlos in French, Don Carlo in Italian. That's a whole story. We're doing it at the Met next year. I'm not supposed to have a favorite opera. I do, and it's Don Carlos. But Don Carlos is a mess. It's a big, sprawling, 5 hours plus, glorious mess. Aida is everything in Don Carlo brought into focus without the mess. So some things are lost too. Some of the rock and roll is lost in Aida from Don Carlos, but what is gained is this perfect clarity. And he wrote the most complicated scene he ever wrote, and you don't know it because ironically it has come to stand for opera. And in the triumphal scene of Act Two of Aida, what you've had is two nations at war, Ethiopia and Egypt, in ancient times, legendary times, not historical. And they're in conflict, and the Egyptians won this battle, and then you get the triumphal scene. So what you have on stage is nations. And if this is, the Nile in ancient times, that's the world, isn't it? or that's the idea. And so you have the whole world, you have armies, you have two kings, Egypt, king of Ethiopia, on the stage singing. You have the high priest, base, bad guy. Verdi and priests did not get along. On the stage, you have two princesses, Amneris, princess of Egypt, and Aida, princess of Ethiopia, but nobody knows she's the princess of Ethiopia. She's incognito. She's the slave to Amneris. And you have all of this going on. But then when you need to, you have the human voice that comes through. And I got to read you one thing. One of the reasons I love Verdi is because he is human, because every human has a story in Verdi. And within their story on the stage, you get a part of you gets to have a story too that might not otherwise. Wagner we'll deal with next week, but Wagner, you've always got to have a bad guy. There's always somebody very, and he's very, very bad, caricature of a bad person. But in Verdi, you know how I said he was thought of as a political composer and he was very associated with the Italian nationalist movement, but it never becomes about they're bad and we're good. And I want to read you from a letter because it's important to this scene in Aida. I really have to go. A few years before this, battles were taking place during the wars of Italian independence. And one of them, again, just like when he was born, is happening on his property. The Austrians who are occupying this area are retreating across his property. And as a parting gesture to Italy, they blew up a few of the buildings in the nearby town. So it was not a pretty war. It was not a gentleman's war. It was ugly. But Verdi wrote to a friend to tell him what's going on. He says, a lot's been happening here. And he says, after this, he says, finally, they've left, the Austrians, the occupying forces. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Is the Kingdom of Italy going to be declared what? He says, finally, they've left, or at least they have withdrawn. And may our lucky star take them even further away, until driven beyond the Alps, they go off to enjoy their own climate, their own sky, which I hope is even clearer, beautiful, and more resplendent than ours. I think that's Verdi in there. This is, by the way, a really good, rather massive biography by Mary Jane Phillips Matz. It's really good. Get it. It's not that Austrians, the enemy, are bad. It's that they need to go home. They need to not be here. We're not better than them. We're not Übermenschen. We're not Herrenmenschen. These are terms of overlords that Wagner will become addicted to. We'll see next week. We're just, this is our home and they need to go away. And in a lot of his he can have a bad guy when he wants one. In Il Trovatore and in Otello, there's some very bad guys. But it's not about that. And there are a lot of his operas where there isn't a bad guy. La Traviata, Rigoletto, or everybody's human. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's go out on this. This is, and what happens, just in a nutshell, the king of Ethiopia, who nobody knows, is Aida's father, or actually, nobody knows the guy who's talking is the king of Ethiopia, is saying to the king of Egypt, you got lucky today. Tomorrow, who knows what fate will do. People say, let them live. Let the Ethiopian prisoners live. And the priests, of course, priests are very bad, are saying, kill. So we have all of this going on. And note how we spotlight is within all this. Let's hear the triumphal, or the ensemble, a pezzo concertato on steroids.
Anch'io pugnai, ventino e fumo, morte invan cercai. questa assisa ch'io vesto vi dica che il mio re la mia patria ho difeso. Sulla sorte a nostrarmi nemica torno vano de forti l'ardir. Al mio pien nella polve disteso già quel re da più colpi trafitto nell'amor della patria è delitto. Siam rei tutti, siam pronti a morir. Ma pure tu, signore possente, a costoro ti volgi clemente. Oggi noi siam percossi dal fato. Domando potria il fato colpir.
Oggi noi siamo per
So go and watch that somewhere. That was from La Scala, 2006. Okay, just real quickly. That's the biggest scene he ever wrote. It's 20 vocal parts going there. The way everything's divided. And it's 3 orchestras. There's the orchestra in the pit. There's the horn choir on stage. There's a backstage orchestra. At the Met, since, we always go a little extra, we've also got one in the ceiling with the horns. It's terrific. And there's a chorus backstage. So there's singers everywhere and 20 vocal parts. But he gets you there. And of course, he starts it with the baritone, the father, the genitor, the generator of it, from a beautiful melody, and layers in everybody. And you can follow. He gets you there. He earns the loud moments, right? And then just when everything is, and you've got to see the conductors like at this point, because the pages of the orchestral score turn about this fast, because there's, about 3 seconds on each one when you have 20 vocal parts and 3 orchestral complete parts per page. And then right at that moment, did you see it? When it just goes to her. And she is it, her voice, her soprano voice. And the effect is, if we did it now in a movie, it would be a cutaway shot or something. I don't know, but just like that. And it's a soprano. And it is, she's the least important person on that stage. There are kings and high priests and princesses, and as far as anybody knows, all she is a slave. And she shuts down 3 orchestras and a chorus of 120 and says, wait a second, what about my needs? She doesn't say that, but she says that. Hello, I'm here. And I'll leave you with a funny story here, well attested by many people. Everybody claims they've been in the room. But very quickly, Shirley Verrett, the great mezzo-soprano, is singing Amneris. And Amneris is a very big role, the Princess of Egypt. And apparently they were in the green room waiting for, at intermission after this scene. And she said to Leontyne Price, no less, who was singing Aida, well, some people even have said that this opera should be called Amneris. And everybody did one of these, like, and looked at Leontyne Price like, you can't say that to the diva. And she was sitting there, fixing her makeup, and they went on. And then the call came for Act 3, which is her great solo scene. And Ashley, can you get on that for that? Yeah. And apparently, Leontyne Price, excuse my language here, but this is some backstage stuff, said her great solo scene, O Pater Mien. She said, okay, it's time for me to show you bitches why this opera is called Aida. Which I only relate because I think that's what Verdi did in the music. And that's what he does constantly when he's all this stuff of nationalism and people. It's all about people in relation to each other. And his message is one that everybody matters. In that soprano, usually often the same soprano who sings Aida, Leontyne Price is very famous, will sing the soprano soloist in the Requiem, which ends with basically the soprano saying that to God, saying, I need your help right now. Liberame, deliver me from eternal death. Right now, it's in the command form. She's not asking. She doesn't have that luxury. Save me. And you can hear her voice. That's all anybody talks about at the end of the Requiem, is how the soprano hit the high B against the chorus of 200 who are trying like anything to drown her out. And you can't do it because the needs of the one are as equal to the needs of the entire universe. I think that's beautiful. And I think that's why we keep coming back to Verdi. And I think I'd better get on the Zoom with the opera quiz or I'm going to be unemployed. And you don't want that. So, Ashley, can you share some of the links and also just go to other links, just experience any Verdi, but with this idea of why is she singing that right now? Why is he singing that? What does this have to do with me? It'll hold up to it and you'll love it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Will. These are the notes that I took on a random index card that was next to me while Will was talking today. As always, really thrilling. You have to go do your quiz now.
I do. And come back for Wagner, because if you think there's a lot to say about Verdi, who doggies? I love Wagner, but it's great. It's a trip. So, okay, let me go. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Will.
By the way, I texted you after our last one and I said, was that okay? And you never texted me back. And I was like, oh my God, she hated it. And then Dimitri wrote me and said, oh, I looked at it. It was good.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it was great. It was great. Oh, that's so funny.
Come on. It's just like, I'm like a singer. You've got to copy
Yes.
Okay. Bye.
Will. And I'm just dropping the website for Holy City Arts and Lyric Opera in the chat. There's information about Will, information about all of Halo's offerings. And thank you so much, newcomers and regulars, for being here. We look forward to being with you next week on Opera 101. Hope you'll join us. Take care all. Be well.